Hey, everybody, welcome to the iDairy podcast. I can't wait for this. I have been following Sara for a long time. She is here. She's an existential psychotherapist, consultant, columnist, and let's get into it. Sara, I am so honored to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about our chat today.
So, Sara, I have been following you for some time. I've been listening to a lot of interviews with you and existential psychotherapist. Let's start first there. Let's get that definition down, and then I'm going to go a lot of different directions with you.
I'm really excited. Yeah. Usually the question is, what is existential psychotherapy versus normal therapy? And I just want to be
Yes.
like, there's no such thing. As in, every therapist practices from a theory or a modality. So the theory I practice from is existentialism, and which is rooted in philosophy. And so all that means is that the way I perceive a client and the way I perceive a problem is rooted in concepts from existential philosophy. So a lot of it, when I see a client, I think about authenticity, about death, about isolation, about meaning, about authenticity, all these kind of core human experiences. So that's kind of what it means to be an existential psychotherapist.
Okay. Well, let me see if I can add to this. That you
Hmm.
brought up authenticity. In your
Hmm.
book, It's on Me, which, by the way, I was up late last night, early this morning. Congratulations on that book.
Thank you so
What a
much.
book. Well, one of the
Thank
many
you.
things that I got from that book is authenticity. You have a different definition of authenticity. It's kind of been thrown around a lot, be more authentic, et cetera. How would an existential psychotherapist define or look at authenticity?
Yeah, so I think we've kind of watered it down and started to misuse authenticity. An example I often have is like people will do something that's maybe inappropriate or hurtful or whatever, and then they'll go, "Well, I'm just being authentic." And it's kind of like the trump card. You can't do anything about that. You go, "Oh, well, I can't silence your voice and I can't do any of these things, like you are being authentic." Um, But what happens in those moments is that the person's actually not taking responsibility for what their actions. And I really like the German sort of root of the term authenticity, and Heidegger is the one that talked about authenticity a lot. And so when you translate the word that he used, I'm not going to try to say it because I would butcher it. It essentially means to own, and I think that's so interesting because to be authentic is to own who you are. It's to own how you show up in the world. It's own this. And so I think to be authentic is actually to be incredibly responsible and aware of how you're showing up in the world.
Great definition. Great definition. And I want to talk now that we set the table here about who you are and a
Mhm.
couple of definitions. Boy, I have, by the way, I live in Idaho, so we talked before we started recording,
Mhm.
and I've traveled overseas briefly, never lived anywhere else other than the
Mm.
United States. Your journey is very different. And
Mhm.
take us back to where were you born, where were you raised, and there's some experiences there that really have shaped you.
Yeah, so I was born in Bosnia, right before the Bosnian War. And so quickly after the war started, we moved to Serbia, where I was raised. And my mom is Serbian. So we went to Serbia, and we were there. And then the NATO bombings of '99 started. And so those were obviously some very salient childhood memories for me. And then after that war, we immigrated to Canada. And so by the age of 9, I've been through a lot. Wars,
Wow.
immigration, all of that was separation of family. My dad had to stay behind while my mom took us overseas. And so there was a lot going on that I would say shaped who I am today, and also shaped my story.
So Sara, I don't know if I can really relate to that. By the way, I keep calling you Sara like I've known you for 20 years. Is
That's,
it
I love
you
that.
okay?
No, that's great. Please do that.
Okay.
Yes.
I never asked if I should keep doctor or not. Okay, Sara.
No,
So
no,
my
no.
childhood up until age 9 was Norman Rockwell type Americana, fairly very stable family and playing baseball. And so I cannot relate to that. And how did you process that, I guess, trauma or what you were living through?
Mhm. I didn't. For a long time, I didn't. So, just as much as you think that your childhood is quote unquote normal, I thought my childhood was normal.
Is that right?
Anyone that I've really known, growing up has gone through a very similar thing or the same thing. And then my family's lived through all of it. And so there was something really interesting about normalizing such severe human experiences or human suffering and being like, oh, yeah, remember that time in a bomb shelter? Like we would say that as if it was like a really relatable, normal thing. I think when I moved to Canada, I was a bit startled in terms of the problems children had around me of like, oh my God, my parents didn't buy me the Nike shoes I wanted. And I remember receiving, a pen for Christmas because that's all we could afford during the war. It's like it was a Mickey Mouse pen, and I was so stoked
Mm,
about it. So there were things that I couldn't fully comprehend, but at the same time, I still didn't realize that this wasn't normal or it wasn't common. And so it was not till my early 20s that I realized that it was actually trauma, that it actually impacted me, and that it was a unique life experience. Until that time, I dismissed it, I minimized it, I normalized it. And it was not something that I thought about as like, wow, this big thing happened and it shaped who I am.
that's incredible. And your Instagram following through the course of your career, your very young career, you've done a lot. My goodness. You
Thank you.
have over 1.6 million followers on Instagram, the Millennial Therapist. What is there about your approach or your message that obviously is connecting with people in a really big way?
I feel so lucky to have my community. And there's a lot of things I would like to, I'm like, it's probably this. It's also a lot of good timing and I feel like I'm very lucky. But what happened early on in my Instagram career was that I kind of started before it was that cool thing to I started right as it was taking off, right?
Did
And
you?
it's some people call me the OG and I like it. I like like I was in the movement, but really there weren't that many accounts floating around. I think when I really got into it, of course there were. And what I noticed was that everyone was like, I am a this kind of really I talk about this kind of problem. And I remember sitting there and being like, oh my God, what is my thing? Like, what is my thing? Am I only talking about trauma because I was a trauma specialist, identity specialist? It's like, is that all I'm going to talk about? And it was like, what is Sara the therapist? How is she presenting to the world? And that was really nerve wracking. And then it was not enjoyable. It was not fun. So for the first couple months, I was like, I'm not enjoying this, and it doesn't feel like a natural form of self expression. Feels quite forced. And then I realized I just don't want to do this. And so my conclusion was I'm going to share what it means to be human, the highs and the lows from my perspective. A perspective that's, colored with my education and my life experience and my clinical experience. And I'm going to make it as authentic as humanly possible and as raw as humanly possible and see if that does anything. Because I think at the core, we all share human experiences. So instead of trying to be like Sara the therapist, it was like, here is how I see the world, or here is how I see my clients see the world, or here is how I see, you know, and I hope that it resonates, and I think it did. And so that was really liberating for me.
I think it did. I think it did. I just want to add to that. I notice so often that when we look at people on Instagram, social comparison, or even all areas of life, look at someone who's having success, and we assume that it's an overnight thing. When really, if you
Yeah,
just
no,
peel back a little bit more, there are years and hours count and a lot of grit that no one ever sees. It sounds like that's part of your story as well. This didn't just happen during COVID when all of a sudden 1.6 million people said,
no.
aha, the millennial therapist.
No, and I think there's just so much, there's so much education and sleepless nights and exams that go into this. And there's so many failed posts and there are so many tears and there's so much bullying online and there's so much, like, there's just so much that comes with it. And again, I'm very, very privileged to have found success in this kind of, if I can say success, but in this kind of area. But
Sure.
at the same time, there's just so much and people don't understand this. Sometimes they still look at algorithms and I go, why isn't this working? What am I doing wrong? And so, yeah, it's not you're just showing up, writing something you like and posting it. it is still work. So if you're failing or struggling while you're listening to this, I've been there and I'm constantly in and out of there. And that's just part of the process. At some point, you just have to kind of embrace it.
It's good. And yeah, if you're one of the few that have not yet following Sarah on Instagram at the Millennial Therapist, do I have that right exactly? At the Millennial Therapist?
Millennial dot therapist.
Oh, okay, good.
Because I
All, that
think
dot
there is
net.
someone millennial therapist. I think that name was taken, so I took millennial dot therapist.
Okay, good, good clarification. Okay, your book, it's on you. I'm sorry,
It's on
your
me.
book. Yeah, gee, I'm projecting. Your book, your book, it's on me. The first, the first phrase in the book is a question: Are you happy? Uh,
Mhm.
Jarring. And why did you start out with that question? That seems the foundation of it all.
Yeah, I think it's because that is the question that broke me. I think that is the question that I haven't really asked myself, or wanted to ask myself. And I had an introduction that had like 3 sentences setting the scene, and then I had the question, "Are you happy?" And I had a friend look at the manuscript and go, um, "I think you just need to start with that question because that's where your journey started." And that was amazing feedback. I was like,
Hmm,
yes, this is it. But that question would have been, the top 3 sentence. And I think for me, a lot of people, we need to be really careful. A lot of people, when they're achieving something or like they have a child, they bought a house, they got a promotion, they graduated from high school, you go, oh my gosh, you must be so happy.
right.
That is not a question, that's an imposition. And I think what was interesting was that I was sitting with a friend and I was telling him about my quote unquote, like, hey, I got engaged. Hey, I'm in grad school. Hey, I'm doing all these wonderful things. And instead of him saying, I'm so happy for you, he went, are you happy? And yeah, I've never been brave enough to ask myself that question. And so he asked it for me, and that was the beginning of kind of my unraveling, my spiraling, my the depth of my self-loss that I experienced.
How did that come about, Sarah? Your the self loss or that moment when it all came crashing down.
So it was multiple moments. I think, my self-loss, I would argue I had a really hard time creating my sense of self in the first place, given all the childhood trauma in terms of
Ah,
I was in survival mode rather than um, self-awareness mode or self-expression mode or self-creation. I was still living as if I was in a perpetual state of threat. Sorry. And so I think that really contributed to it. But I talk about how my early 20s and to some extent were more painful than my childhood. And that's because I was a willing participant in my self-betrayal. I was a willing participant in the decisions I was making that were so inauthentic and that led to this self-loss, that led to this separation, that led to the point where I looked in a mirror and didn't recognize myself.
wow.
And so I think that contribution was really painful. As a child, I was a victim. As an adult, I was the perpetrator of my own loss. And so I think, there are so many moments that led to me feeling this way. And then that question was one of the first times I recognized it. And there's something really painful when you recognize it. But I remember like crying at that restaurant with my friend, being really distraught, having a moment in a mirror where I looked at myself and was like, I hate this person. I don't know this person. Like really intense emotions that I start up my book with. And then I went home, watched Friends in my hotel room, ordered a burrito, and went to bed and was like, wow, sweet, you did it. Cool. That was a
Yeah.
moment of, and it wasn't, that was just the beginning of me recognizing the loss and feeling the pain. But I thought that was it. I was like, wow, one really bad night. I did it. I aced it.
So the self loss, I've heard you say in an interview, maybe I read it in your book, that it is part of the human condition. Do I have that right? And if so, are you saying that all of us are, I'm connecting some dots I probably shouldn't, but all of us, well, we may be experiencing self loss and we just don't know it?
So I'm saying it's one of the, I think, greatest human sufferings that has gone unacknowledged because it's not a diagnosis. And I think there's a
Ah,
lot of ways for us to suffer that is not a diagnosis. I a human condition in terms that every human is susceptible to it and can experience it. Do I think everybody has experienced self-loss? No. Do I think everyone has experienced inauthenticity, which is like a step before self-loss? Yeah, I do.
Okay.
I think it's very common to do things that are inauthentic or show up in an inauthentic way. But do I think everyone suffered from self-loss? No. Do I think a lot of people have? Yeah. I
So
needed some empirical research on this.
Ah, yes, for sure. So the two questions in the book, let me
Yeah.
back up. So the two questions, who am I? Why am I here? The question of who am I? That feels
Yeah.
like a question that just cannot be answered. Am I just giving up here, or coach me a little bit?
No, I think it's a provocative question. It's a difficult question, and I don't think it's a question that can be answered cognitively, as in verbally. So when I say who are you, I don't think you can give me a comprehensive answer just by talking to me. I think the answer of who am I is answered by the way we live. So of course you need to have an understanding of your roles and your sense of morality and you know the way that you recognize yourself and identify with yourself. However, I don't think the sense of self exists without expression. And so the way that you show up in the world is who you are. And I have a quote that's like, you might like this or not, but who you are in this moment is who you are. You can have these thoughts about I am such and such person, but if your actions do not reflect that, you're not genuinely that person or you haven't become that version of yourself yet. And so I do think that who am I is something that's lived and experienced, not just something that's cognitively answered.
So this is a little more pop psychology on my part. By the way, my background is, if you couldn't tell, that I have no psychology background. I shouldn't have to explain that. But one of the things that I've talked about, and we've done podcast episodes on, if you want to know what someone values, don't look at what they say, look at where they spend their time. Is
Love
that
that.
related at all to what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, when people say I don't know how to identify my value, I'll usually get them to write down everything they did in a day and how much time they spent on it. And it's not that you value video games, it's that you value connection, maybe because you're talking to your mates over the mic as you're killing zombies. I don't know.
Yeah, that is. That's
Racing cars. I don't Do you know what I
I
mean? It's
like it.
like what is driving that behavior? That's usually the value.
It's
Or
good.
escapism, which is also really great to identify. But I think, you know,
Hmm.
we would like we would like to think that the self is this really beautiful thing that we can construct and then preserve and it's inside of us and it can never be changed or altered and we can always go back to it. And it's like that's why people go find yourself, as if that self already exists somewhere. It was given
Right.
to you and it's perfect. And this is saying you create yourself through your actions, and that's
Good.
a very different vibe. And that is not a comfortable vibe because I think a lot of us create a very inauthentic self. And
Hmm.
I don't think there's a neutral self. There's no like, hey, I did this today and it has a neutral impact on me. It's like you did this today and you're either in alignment with yourself and who you want to be or you're not. That particular action. There is no middle, lukewarm, oh, well, this has no consequence on me. And I think that that's a lot of responsibility and it sounds a bit tedious.
Wow. Okay, you're taking us deep here. By the way, if I may revert back
Mhm.
to, yeah, playing games, the zombie, that is Call of Duty, just so you know.
Oh, thank
The
you. That is what it's called. Yeah. You
that
can tell
is,
I did not game.
well, I over the holidays, I gamed with my kids, and I was it wasn't
That's
pretty. But
amazing.
anyway, so hey, one of the things that I appreciate about you is that, well, the book even gives us some clues on this. It's on me. Accept hard truths, discover yourself, and change your life. One of those hard truths that you have in your book is this: who you are in this moment, whether you are on a plane, sitting at your kitchen table, or on your bed, is who you really are. If you don't like who that is, it is up to you to do something about it. That feels very direct to me. And tell me a little bit more about that statement, not in a bad way, but that's very laser focused, saying your actions and it's up to you to change it.
Yeah. So I don't shy away from hard truth. I'm quite direct in my approach.
Yes, you are.
And I think it's needed. I actually don't think it's helpful not to tell the truth. And sometimes that truth is difficult to hear. But not telling someone that they're responsible for who they become, I don't think is doing them any favors. I also find responsibility an incredibly empowering and liberating concept. I never see it as a shaming or blaming concept. So I think it depends what your relationship with responsibility is, with how harsh this statement seems. If you think it's pointing fingers, if you think it's shaming, if you don't like who you are in that moment, that's going to be a really intense statement. If you look at this statement and go, wow, I am so free and so liberated to be the person I want to be, that, yeah, it's a hard truth, but it's actually a really nice kind of peppy truth. So I think a lot of that opens some space up for projections. But I think the way that you relate to that statement actually tells you a lot about the relationship you have with yourself.
Hmm.
And yeah, I think responsibility is great. I think I have very positive connotations, because it was only when I started being responsible for my life that I wanted to actually live it. I did not enjoy my life prior to that.
Tell me more about that. What was the situation you were living through when you realized you weren't living your life or enjoying your life? By the way, if I may, at 24
Mhm.
years old, just from the you had the world by the tail. Oh my gosh, for any 24-year-old to be doing what you were doing, you should have, here's my should statement, you should have been
Yeah,
just over the moon happy.
exactly. It's why I was trying to convince myself that I was happy. I was like, you have no reason to be unhappy. Everyone in the world is telling you should be happy. The girl from the bomb shelter, the 7 year old, would have looked at you now and been like, wow, you're amazing. And yet you're here feeling incredibly anxious and depressed and not really wanting to be alive. So why? And I think the thing about it is, you can accomplish all the things in the world, but unless they align with you, unless they're an expression of yourself, they're not going to mean anything. Meaninglessness is a huge, very real concept. And everything, I picked the wrong relationship to be in. The only thing I kept from that time in my life was my love for psychology.
Hmm.
Everything else, my friends, my relationship with my family, some were, everything changed. Geographical location changed. Literally everything about my life in that moment changed. And it wasn't easy, and I had no funds to do it. I think a lot of people are like, well, you just kind of got up. It's like I had $800 in my bank account. I was getting a divorce, and I went to back to Serbia to face my trauma. This
Oh
wasn't
my.
like I went to Bali and I tanned and I had thousands of dollars in sponsors and then I was like, I found myself. It was not an experience like that. And for me, it was just, I felt during my panic attacks, which was one of the repercussions or one of the manifestations of my loss, I thought I was going to die. And there was a very clear moment where I went, I want to live before I die. And I want my life to feel like my own. I felt like I was checking off all the checklists for other people, even people that didn't ask me to do it for them. I did it. And so it was my time to take distance from the space I've co-created with others and actually allow myself to be the only common denominator. So when you're traveling and you're experiencing different cultures and different foods and different spaces and different mattresses, whatever you're like, the only thing that stays the same is you, and you start to see patterns of like, oh, here's a little common thread. And that was incredibly helpful for me, although unnerving. So my journey during that time, I actually had to remove myself from my life quite severely. And I'm not suggesting everyone has to do that, but I think my loss was so deep that any part of that lingering was very painful, and it didn't allow me to create my sense of self.
So, Sarah, as you were creating that sense of self during that time, was it intentional, your path going back to Serbia and every move you took, or looking back on it now, it just makes a lot of sense what you were doing?
Yeah, I mean, going to Europe was definitely intentional. Going to Serbia was very intentional. I have maybe gone back once, twice max before that time. And so I went back to like the town where I grew up and where the bomb shelters were. I went back to town where, my school was. I very much separated myself from the Serbian culture and the heritage, because there was just so much pain and I didn't want to identify with any of it. So I identified fully as a Canadian. And so it was an interesting thing to go and listen to the music and get like just be immersed in the culture again, a culture that very much informs me and a culture that I very much accept now as part of my
Yes.
identity. But there was just I kind of went, well, life is already hell. How much worse can it get? Let me just fully immerse myself. It's going to be like the Phoenix experience or it's going to kill me, and that's fine. I'm okay either way.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable story. When you go into a crowded room and there's a lot of conversations happening, but yet you can pick out when someone says your name, you can just hear it, or
Mhm.
you look at a big document and you can identify your name. Well, in your book, there's a quote here. It's a killer quote from Soren Kierkegaard, and it's this podcast, as you know, is I Dare You, and you've got a great quote here. It says, "To dare is to lose one's footing momentarily. Not to dare is to lose oneself." Piece that together for me. How's that fit into this whole discussion about losing self or finding self?
Yeah, I think so many of us live on autopilot because we're so scared to disrupt whatever script we have in our minds, whatever expectations we have in our minds. And so we don't even try. And I think so many of us take the easy way. Or sometimes it's not easy. It's the only way we know how, as for me in my early 20s, until my early 20s. And so we don't want to disrupt anything because it's too scary. And then we realize that this lack of disruption to the life we have now might be the thing that's actually hurting us or causing us pain or separating us or making us existentially feel dead. And so I like that quote because in reality, every action and inaction has a consequence. And we think that an inaction or being passive in our lives is the safer thing to do. And I don't think that that's true. I actually think it's the complete opposite. You have to perpetually be creating your sense of self. It is not stagnant. It is not concrete in terms of you do it once and that's it. You should be a very different person a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. And so I like that he has this like really empowered, like dare to do the things that scare you because the loss that you're going to experience if you don't is so deep and so severe. And he has other great quotes of like, if you lose things like your wife, your keys, I mean, he's being funny. He's like, you would notice. Yet we lose ourselves and we don't notice. How is that even possible?
Hmm.
Obviously I'm like summarizing his quote, and I think that
Sure.
that's this is not how he said, although he did use wife as an example. So I love that of like there's a consequence to an action, and sometimes the loss of self is so severe and is so profound and is something that we should deliberately be um trying never to experience.
It's good. Again, another pop psychology heads up. I'm coming your
Mhm.
way. So at the end of
I
it,
love it.
when I do public speaking, there's an end at some meetings. So there at the very end, there'll be a point where I'm asking people to make a decision. It's at the end of the meeting.
Mm,
You've heard a lot of training, a lot of good information about what could happen in your life. So now, what's your decision going to be? And if you say yes, here's what you need to do. But don't mistake the fact that if you say no, that is still a decision. And
mm,
that sounds like in
mhm.
part about what you're saying, correct? In other words, you may not decide to take that fork in the road, but by staying right where you are, that is still a decision. And I think for me, I miss that a lot, but I think a lot of people miss that. Yes?
Absolutely. I miss that a lot too. An indecision, a lack of choice is still a choice. A lack
Hmm.
of decision to do a particular thing is still a decision to do another thing. Again, no neutral path, no pause button. It's whatever you're doing is a choice. Even if you're choosing to do the same thing over and over again, every day that you do it, it's a brand new choice.
Hmm. Sarah, I like you. I like you a lot.
Thank
You've
you.
given you
Like
have
to.
given so many interviews. One thing I am blown away about how you are so passionate about sharing this insight and knowledge with others. And you've given so many podcast interviews. Is there any particular question that it just has not been asked yet that I should have asked here in this interview?
Oh my gosh. I think you have some really great questions.
Well, thank you.
Nothing that I can think of off the top of my head.
Okay, so very good. Well, I'm glad. I'm honored then. Okay, so now, Sarah, one of the things that, let me back up. By the way, I'm looking at the clock. We're going to hit this.
No
Um,
worries.
Sarah, back up. So, Sarah, what is the best way to follow you and all the cool work that you're doing? Where should we go?
Yeah, so millennial.therapist on Instagram is probably my primary platform. And then I started Substack, which I'm really passionate about. It's going to be a really big emphasis for me. So that's, if you're unfamiliar, like a newsletter blog sort of sphere, and it's called Notes from My Phone. That's because I have a lot of thoughts throughout the day, and I'll write them down quickly on my phone, and then I'll write articles out of them or share those notes with everybody. And I started something called the Phenomenological Society. It's also on this blog, and that's if you're really into existentialism. If you want to learn more about existentialism, this is more like the philosophy side of things. While Notes from My Phone are the psychology side of things. So that's kind of where I'm at. And you can get my book anywhere books are sold.
It's good. Name of the book, It's on Me. Accept hard truths, discover yourself, and change your life. Sarah, at the end of every podcast, I ask all my
Mhm.
guests, what is your I Dare You challenge for all of us? So I cannot wait for this. What would you dare us to do or try in order to live a better life? What do you think?
Oh, that's a hard one, but I'll be nice. So I dare you to do this for a month. It's a journaling exercise. At the end of each day, answer one question. What did you learn about yourself? We live in this constant, I don't want to say delusion, but like illusion that we know who we are just because we are who we are. We're like, I know who I am. And then we don't observe, we don't pay attention, we don't check in. And this is an actually really difficult question to answer if you're not paying attention to yourself. What did you learn about yourself today? Did it reinforce a belief you had? Did it shatter the belief you have? Did it shock you that you honked and flipped someone off when you drove? Like, what did you learn? What was the trigger today? What helped you relax? So I think it's just a really fun way to start your journey of creating that self and being more intentional.
I like that I Dare You challenge. That's really good. Now, you said you were going to be nice. Is that what it was?
Yeah, that's
So, Sarah, this has been a treat. All the way from Australia. I mentioned before we started recording, had I known you were in Australia, I would have messed up the time zones, but we made it happen. It has been such an honor having you on this podcast. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with all of us.
Thank you so much for having me and for all the wonderful questions.